to Camilla.
Hi. Yes, so my name's Camilla. It's a pleasure. This is the second of the webinars that I've hosted as part of Sheffield Tree Week. It follows on really nicely. So Catherine launched the week with a talk about her role as a community forestry manager, what that means in Sheffield. And we had a great talk yesterday about tree planting targets. And actually one of the things we didn't talk about in that is what the impact of losing 95% potentially of ash trees across the UK. So it's the third most populous broadleaf tree species. And right now, a thing that I've been struck by is that I thought this year was going to be quite focused on ash dieback and flattening the curve in terms of costs to local authorities, and then been completely blindsided by the events of the last few months. But nonetheless, I think anyone who's left Sheffield and travelled out to the peaks might well have started to see what ash dieback looks like and what it feels like. And I think for that reason, it's really important for us to have a conversation about what that means for the region and what it means for Sheffield. So we're really lucky today to be joined by Luke Barley, who is the Trees and Woodlands Manager for the National Trust. He's going to be talking about the national context for this and the work that he did as a ranger in the White Peak. And then Nathan McWhinnie, who is one of the tree officers at Sheffield City Council and who has drawn up the ash dieback strategy for Sheffield. We're going to be talking about some of the realities and implications for people who work with trees, but also at the end we're going to be talking about sort of resilience and actually what we can do as a community to help mitigate the effects of this. So without further ado, actually before we go any further, I'm going to be hosting questions, so do feel free at any point just to put something in the Q&A. We'll look to get through as many of those as possible within an hour. And yeah, so without further ado, I'm over to Luke, who's going to tell us a bit about the national context for ash dieback.
Great, thanks Camilla, and hi everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, so just give me one moment while I do that. Okay, are you seeing that now? Good. Yeah, thanks for that really good overview intro, Camilla. Yeah, so a little bit about my role. Yeah, I work for the National Trust in a central role, doing all sorts of things tree and woodland related, from managing woods for nature to looking after ancient trees, tree safety management, and stuff to do with our woodland creation ambition, which I talked a little bit about yesterday. I'm also leading our response to ash dieback, which is occupying a lot of my time at the moment. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 or 15 minutes is really give an overview of what the national picture looks like, what the disease is all about, and then Nathan's going to talk a little bit more about what it actually means in the area local to us and Sheffield Council's strategy for its own response. So hopefully this should take it nicely from that overview down to the local. That's the plan. Okay, so ash. Most of you will know, as Camilla said, it's our third most common tree species, we think. You do get slightly different views on that depending on the source you go to, but it's certainly, you know, a really common tree and a very important one, because, you know, the important thing to say is, you know, we don't have many canopy tree species in this country, and so, you know, the significance of losing one of them, you know, in functional terms in the short term is really significant, because it doesn't leave us with many native canopy species, which is one of the big worrying things really. So big trees like that one in the bottom right. We think on National Trust land it covers something like 12% of canopy cover, so that sort of shows the proportion of trees that are ash on our land, although again it's really difficult to tell that kind of thing. And here's some examples of ash dieback. So what we typically see is that picture on the right. You know, fairly obviously it is the dieback of the crown. It's all there in the name. Sometimes we see the blackening leaves, like in the top picture, and that's the actual fungus affecting those leaves this year when the spores land on the outside of the crown, and they colonize the functional bit of the wood, where all the action's happening, sort of from the outside in on the crown. And then the tree retrenches, sometimes slowly if it's a healthy tree, And if there are other stress factors involved, it can be quite a rapid decline. Then you might also see these lesions on the bark in the bottom picture, and they're quite symptomatic of this particular ash dieback. Obviously, ash trees can decline and die for lots of reasons, whether it's drought or frost damage, or lots of other things. But it's only really ash dieback that causes these lesions. And then in the top left picture, that's the little mushrooms on the fallen leaf litter that's infected, and that's where the spores for the next round of infection come from. And you can sometimes see those under trees that are affected by ash dieback. Yeah, what I haven't said actually is the proper name. So just to say, you also hear this called Callara a lot, which is an old scientific name. Its current proper scientific name is Hymenocyphus fraxineus, but people typically refer to it as Callara. One of the big sort of, as I mentioned with the tree on the right dying fast or slowly, one of the big things with ash dieback is how easily other stress factors can hasten decline, really. And then we also get a lot of secondary infection by species like honey fungus, and that can affect the stability of the tree and also affect crown health. So it can be a vicious circle of decline with lots of different stress factors, which we'll touch on again. Callara was first recorded in Britain in 2012, although it was probably here in the wild earlier. It was first found on nursery trees in 2012, though. And you can see from this map the sort of spread from the southeast and East Anglia. This map's a couple of years out of date, but you can sort of see the nature of the spread. I'd be really surprised if any of those grid squares, certainly in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, are still blank, based on what I'm understanding from my colleagues across England, Wales and Northern Ireland in the National Trust. It's pretty much everywhere now, but you can see the way it's spread. There's lots of different theories about how it arrived in Britain. The spores are windblown, so they go a heck of a long way. And they might have just made it across the channel. They might have come on those imported trees, or they might have simply come on ferries. There's a pretty compelling theory that they might have been either in the back of trucks or just sort of swept along inside those cavernous spaces inside ferries, because there do seem to be concentrations around freight ports in 2012, but we don't really know. But it was certainly hastened in its arrival by globalized trade. It's endemic to East Asia, where it's sort of co-evolved with the ash species over there, so they're either adapted to it or it's part of their cycles of sort of increase and decline at a population scale. And it's made it all the way across Europe, essentially due to globalized trade. And either way, it's here to stay. There's nothing we can do about it now. And the implications for our ash trees are still slightly unknown. We can learn a lot from looking at the experience on the continent, but we can't really say anything for certain, because our ash are genetically slightly different for lots of reasons. And there are lots of other factors around landscape and geology involved too. But based on a Europe-wide perspective, like, it isn't a great picture, if I'm honest. We're looking at probably 70 to 95% of trees being affected to some degree, and most of them dying. So it will be very, very significant over a sort of 10 to 15-year period, with a very patchy effect. So some areas experience decline and death very rapidly, and some areas it takes a lot longer. And then there will be that small proportion of trees that are tolerant or resistant, and they're able to repopulate Britain with an ash population in decades and centuries time. So yeah, as Camilla alluded to, like a lot of infectious diseases, it's the shape of the infection is a bell-shaped curve. So it does sort of trickle along, getting gradually worse and worse, and then suddenly hit an exponential point. And I think at a lot of places now we are in that exponential point. Some places hit it a couple of years ago, and that's really the sort of chalk and limestone landscapes, those calcareous landscapes with poor soils. The trees are already stressed. They're probably already drought stressed. They get hit a lot harder, more rapidly. So the White Peak, for instance, Dovedale, places like that, has been in the exponential phase for a couple of years, whereas Sheffield, I don't think we're there yet, to be honest, but obviously we're only 30 miles away, so we're probably getting the same spore load in. It's down to the health of the trees, really. But it will hit the exponential phase sometime soon. You know, we can say that with confidence based on the experience elsewhere. And yeah, just to illustrate that, you know, this is on the left-hand side, this is the Longshore estate. So obviously these ash trees, you can see that they've already had big reductions for safety reasons, but those crowns that still remain should be really healthy and were really healthy a couple of years ago, and they're now in pretty serious decline, even at Longshore. And you can see the tree on the right has died completely. And then the trees in the right-hand picture, they're down in the White Peak, and this is actually last summer, so they're probably worse this year. Really, really typical ash dieback in a young secondary woodland. That's what it looks like. It's a pretty disheartening sight, if I'm honest. And then this is Lathkildale this year, and we've really had it bad this year. Well, I say our trees have really had it bad this year because we've been in drought, and we experienced that really late, really hard frost, and lots of trees got really hammered by that when they were already drought stressed, and particularly with ash dieback on top of it. So Lathkildale isn't looking very pretty at all, and I've not been to any of the other dales, but I expect that it's a similar picture there. So the National Trust's response to ash dieback has two sort of strands to it, really, which they do overlap, but we try to keep them separate, because the first is our tree safety management regime, which is obviously a compliance issue around keeping people safe. And then our other bit of the response is around nature conservation and trying to limit the impacts in that respect, as well as their culture, you know, the cultural value of ash trees. So there is a lot of overlap, but we have to approach them sort of separately just to make sure we're getting that compliance bit covered off. Obviously, as the trees decline and die, there is a risk when they're near where people go, and we have to manage that. All of our tree safety management is really carefully prioritised so that we do invest our resources where the most people gather, so whether it's roads or our busiest paths, our car parks, all that kind of thing. And then obviously, if there isn't any risk to people, we don't intervene at all for safety reasons. So hopefully that goes without saying. With ash dieback, we've had to add another sort of strand to our policy, really, and working with other big landowning organisations, and based on our experience of places like the White Peak and the South Downs over the last few years, our policy now is really to inspect all of our ash trees in June, and if their crowns have lost more than 50% of their foliage, or if they've got any of the other more subtle symptoms associated with ash dieback that can be quite telling of what sort of state they're in, like big basal lesions on the bark, we do earmark them for removal when they're in high use zones. And that's going to cost us a lot of money, a huge amount of money. In fact, our best estimate is that it could cost us 25 to 40 million pounds over the next 10 to 15 years, which is, you know, the same amount of money that we can't spend on our really positive conservation work. So it's pretty disheartening in that respect. And that's based on the Tree Council's really brilliant work on what ash dieback could cost the nation in terms of safety. And this year, I mean, I have to say, I've been completely occupied with ash dieback for the last week or two, and we're not getting very encouraging results from our inspections from all across the country. And considering what a bad year it is for the National Trust and the nation generally, we're going to have a real challenge on to meet our safety liability around ash, and it's going to be very difficult for the organisation. But yeah, we will figure it out. And this picture, just to illustrate, this is Dovedale last year. Some of you may recognise some of these characters. This is Sheffield Tree Care at work, felling literally hundreds of ash that met that criteria I described, and which would either drop branches or fall on the main path through Dovedale as they decline and die. And we get about 1 million visitors a year on this path in Dovedale, so that is one of our higher use footpaths. So it was, you know, it was beholden on us to intervene there to keep people safe, really. This is also a slightly interesting one because it does illustrate that there can be, you know, some nature conservation positives associated with ash dieback that we have to sort of hang on to and maximise. So areas of grassland like that you can see on the bank to the right, they're actually quite species rich with sort of wildflowers of open downland. So there's a little bit of species rich grassland restoration going on there, and we can sort of, you know, make sure that we subtly alter the design of our safety work to maximize those benefits. So we have to hang on to those positives where we can, really. In other places, it's much more appropriate to replant with alternative species and make sure that we're maintaining tree cover. It's all dependent on the site, really. It's also really important that we work in partnership on this, because obviously it's not just a National Trust issue. And the best example of this currently is the Devon Ash Dieback Resilience Forum. And this is a partnership of, you know, every major landowner in Devon and the council working together on dieback, which is absolutely fantastic. And what we're finding as an organisation that covers England, Wales and Northern Ireland is that it's just really patchy by council and by region, really, how well we're able to work together. We've worked pretty well together in the Peak District with people like Natural England and the Park Authority, and with the Chatsworth Estate, where we shared the cost of traffic management in Taddington Wood, where we both had to fell roadside trees. So those are the kinds of economies of scale that we need to look at, and we really do need to work well together. And I know Nathan and others have done some brilliant work on trying to get local partnerships started in this area, which is fantastic. So I suppose, yeah, tree safety is just what we have to do. And in some respects, it's quite black and white in that respect, although it's disappointing. It gets much more challenging, really, I suppose, when we're trying to intervene to maintain the nature conservation and cultural value of ash trees. So I just thought I'd give you a couple of examples of places where we've got issues and, you know, how we're going about trying to tackle them, I suppose. This is Watend Lath, which some of you will know. It's in the Lake District, and it's a really special raised valley off to the side of Borrowdale. And it's full of these ancient ash pollards, and they really are very beautiful trees that are really important in terms of nature conservation. They've got species like lungwort on them, this lichen that's in the bottom right, and that's restricted to really, really old, typically ash trees, a couple of other species occasionally, in areas with very, very clean air. And, you know, we're potentially just going to lose most of the trees where that lives, sadly. So in some places, not just the lakes, we are looking at translocating species like lungwort onto other species where it will exist, although we're having mixed results so far. Then, as some of you will know, there's a lot of, a huge amount of beetles and other invertebrates associated with the decay in old trees like this. So they're at risk as well. So it's really sad. And then that's not to mention the cultural aspect of a place like this, where these pollards have been being cut for tree fodder, for the livestock and for firewood and for other uses for literally centuries by the farmers there. And we're going to lose that amazing cultural legacy. So it's really sad. So, I mean, the obvious thing there that we can do is plant new trees, which the rangers are doing, of other species that are appropriate to the site. But it's going to be a heck of a long time before those trees, hold any of the same values that these ash pollards do, unfortunately. Yeah, this is just another example, really. This is Yokenthwaite. This is up above. This is up above Yokenthwaite in the Yorkshire Dales, in Swaledale. It's just another fantastic wood pasture landscape with these phenomenal open grown ash. There is some evidence from Europe that open grown ash might be more tolerant to the disease for lots of different reasons. And so we're hoping that some of these open grown specimens will be able to resist it better, but we should just have to wait and see. And again, if they do start to be affected, our only action really will be to replant new widely spaced landscape trees to try and offer some of the same value over very many decades and centuries, but not in the short term. And then likewise, we've got some amazing ash woods. And again, we've got some ones really close by. The White Peak Ravine woods are one of the best examples here. And they're typically on chalk and limestone soils, where we've got these very, very ancient ash woods that are particularly special for wildflowers. And that's just one example. Herb Paris down in the picture on the right. And some of these woodland wildflowers are associated with the light canopy that ash casts, and the fact that so much light still gets to the woodland floor all summer, and it's just enough shade to suppress the bramble often, but enough light to allow the wildflowers to thrive on the limestone. So it's a really special woodland type. Eagle-eyed tree spotters amongst you will notice that that's not actually an ash, the main tree in this picture. That's a lime, which is one of the really, really special rare trees that we sometimes find in these ash woods. So our management really is to encourage more of the other tree species that are native to these woods to colonize the parts that where the ash are dying. And there's lots of reasons why they don't do that naturally, typically, or haven't recently. But some of it's just human intervention and the use we've made of those woods recently. So we feel now, having sort of left them as proxy wildwoods for decades really in nature conservation, now is the time to intervene to make sure that they're more diverse in terms of tree species, so they maintain what's important about them. And this again is just an example. This is actually in Taddington Wood, which is one of our White Peak ash woods that the Trust looks after. This is the ranger team. They felled glades in the ash, basically, often around other species that we want to promote if they exist already, and where they don't, we're planting new trees, which again, that's been quite a contentious and difficult decision, but we think it's the right thing to do to maintain those woods as functional woodland ecosystems. I would just say, before anyone says anything, we are really trying to move away from plastic tubes, but these ones snuck in under the radar. So yeah, we're trying our best in that respect. In other types of wood, mixed wood, it's less concerning. It's really sad to be losing a canopy tree species, as I mentioned, but it might actually, it will create some nice light areas in some of our mixed woods, which might see benefits for other woodland species. And so, we can look at the positive there and utilize ash dieback to help us, manage the woods really well for nature in other respects, I suppose. But we must ensure those woods are resilient through canopy tree species diversity. So once we lost ash, if we're only left with one or two other canopy species, then we really should be looking at supplementary planting to make sure that they're resilient to future threats. Because if we lose the remaining species, what are we going to be left with? And that's a big issue for us, really, is that tree species diversity. Last but not least, I just wanted to touch on the cultural and human impact. So as many of you will know, ash is really important in lots of sort of folklore traditions, particularly Norse mythology, and that picture on the left is Yggdrasil, the world tree, which is commonly understood to be an ash. And then the more practical use that we've made out of ash through history is also really well known. It was one of the main woods for tool handles and lots of other uses. And some of you no doubt will have read Rob Penn's really brilliant book where he felled an ash tree and took the wood to lots of different artisans to build their products out of it, which they would have traditionally used ash for. So we will lose that sort of cultural, we're at risk of losing that cultural heritage as well, and we must try our hardest to cling on to that, I think. And one of the things that we would have done in the Trust this year, if it hadn't been for coronavirus, is try to do some programming around ash and its cultural legacy, and in particular even just around recording what we've got. So if I talk to some of the old boys I work with who remember elm in the landscape, they often talk about being sad about the fact that we don't have really good records or photographs of some of those really amazing old elm trees or what the landscapes look like with elm in them. So I think it's really important that we just take lots of photographs and make lots of art and poetry and literature and however else we might choose to record our ash before they go. We must hang on to that, and as I say, we'd have liked to have done more with that in the Trust this year, and obviously it ain't been the year for it. So that's a really quick overview from me. Just in summary, really, it's not a pretty picture, I'm afraid, but we must hang on to the positives and look for the opportunities to either connect people to trees or find nature conservation benefits where possible. There will inevitably be trees we have to remove for safety reasons, both on Trust land and everywhere else, and it's going to be really sad, but it is inevitable. But where we don't have to remove them for safety reasons, we need to leave as many upright as possible so that we find the ones that are tolerant to the disease. Wherever we have to remove them, and in lots of places where we're just losing them, we must replant or ensure natural regeneration through other means. And when we do that, we must consider biosecurity, so where we're getting the trees from, so we don't bring any more diseases in. And we must consider future resilience, so making sure we've got a good spread of site native tree species to ensure resilience. And just to reiterate, we must look for those benefits, look for the opportunities for positive action amongst us, really, for nature. Last but not least, the bigger picture, we must try to hold government to account to sort out border biosecurity. We don't know for sure that this came in on imported young trees, but it could have done. And there are lots of other diseases in Europe that, we risk importing on young nursery stock. So we must get that sorted out. And you can all help there by, at the very least, being a smart consumer of plants and making sure you know where they come from when you plant. Okay, that's all from me. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Nathan and look forward to some questions afterwards.
Oh, Nathan, you're muted. Thank you for that, Luke. That was fantastic. And yeah, Nathan,
almost inevitable, but that was going to happen.
very polite. I'm going to duck out now.
All right. Hi everybody. I'm Nathan McWhinnie, Tree Officer with the Council. I've been mainly coordinating the ash dieback response from the Council's point of view. We, fortunately, before this all kicked off, we had an iTree survey done to weigh up what kind of canopy we've got and the tree species we have. That gave us the result that we've got 6.6% of our tree cover is ash in Sheffield. That's around about 250,000 trees, the majority of which, according to the survey, are on public land, and that includes 2,500 trees on the highway, ash trees. Now, we reckon that we may lose up to 136,000 of those trees within Sheffield. Not all of those are going to be in areas where they're posing a public danger, so most of them could be left. We estimate that we personally within the council may have to lose or fell 25,000 trees over the course of the next 10 years. But again, it's only an estimate so far. We figure that is going to cost us £1 million at least, if it's just 25,000. That is working on the basis of £400 a tree. As we'll see as we go through this, the logistical difficulties of felling some of the larger trees send those costs way up, because once they get to a certain point, they become quite dangerous to fell, and therefore you have to be very careful and use extra machinery. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. We've been conducting surveys for ash dieback for the last couple of years, and they're based on some of these categories that other councils have been using before us. The councils in the south and east of the country, like Norfolk and Kent and Suffolk, they're ahead of us in the disease, so they've been dealing with this for a while now and have survey data dating back to 2016 or so. Now, these are classes that this German professor put together. You can see on the top line, that's a full canopy. They're out of leaf on the left-hand side and in leaf on the right. With the full canopy, you can see you have one main shoot going up the center and then side shoots coming out. So when the ash tree is in full pomp, it has those extended side shoots. One of the first signs that it's going is the second row there, which is called 1, where you lose those side shoots. So this kind of form is quite diagnostic of a tree that is in decline. You get a kind of jagged outline. You get very thin branches coming up that are like a bit like foxtails. And these categories translated totally into this handy guide, which Suffolk put together. So this is what we base our surveys on. 100% live crown in the top left, going down 75% live, 50% live, and 25% live. These are kind of rough approximations. Obviously, there are various degrees in between all of these categories. So when we're assigning a category, we have to make our best guess. Now, I'll show you some of these in Sheffield. This is from South Street Park, which is the one just behind the train station. This is from last year, actually, but you can see it's quite a difference here. These two trees are roughly the same age. A lot of the trees in South Street Park were planted at the same time. And you can see the discrepancy between these two. That one, I would say, is more like somewhere in between 100% and 75% live crown. The other one, more like it's getting down towards 50% of its live crown. Now, there's no topographical difference between these two. There's no particular, there doesn't appear to be any difference in the ground conditions or the environmental conditions. So this one, I would say, is just down to genetics. And we see this quite a lot where we get fairly healthy trees right next to trees that are hit extremely badly. It's, as I say, it's just genetics, as far as we can tell. And then there are other factors that Luke was flagging up about, you're talking in terms of the topology, hydrology, geology, affecting ash trees as well. This is one from Porter Clough. We found that the disease seems to be moving across Sheffield from the south and particularly the southwest. So this is probably the worst site that we've got in Sheffield, Porter Clough. And this tree and many others up this particular section are going to be felled in early September, which will be a big job. That's obviously on the Sheffield round walk, so we're going to have to close the round walk, close the road, and we'll be working with Amy to fell our trees and their trees, because this one happens to be on highways land. The land on the right hand side of the road is all parks land. This is one that's in Crooks Valley Park. This is from this year. Now, as I say, the disease is spreading up from the south and southwest. These trees in here were not anywhere near as bad as this last year, but you can see now that the disease has spread quite far into the city. And the next one this is also in Crooks Valley Park. Again, you can see this tall tree that's just to the left of the centre is an ash that's, I would say, roughly between 75% and 50% of its live crown remaining. But the ash directly behind it, look, absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with them at all. And these trees are just about 50 or so yards from the ash in the previous slide, which is probably a roughly 25% or less of its crown. So that one is coming out this year as well. This is one in Hillsborough Park. Again, we're getting quite close to the centre of the town. These are from this year. That previous photo of South Street Park was from last year, and this one, these are trees opposite the park. I don't know if you know Shrewsbury Road or Shrewsbury Road. These are directly over that road, but on private land. So these are ones that we're going to have to refer on to the highways enforcement team, and they will have to trace those owners and put an enforcement notice on the trees. This is more from South Street Park. This is just by the railway line there, the tram line, sorry. Right, these are our statistics from last year. Now we did, these categories at the bottom are based on the trunk diameter. This is how we measure our trees. So we take, at a height of 1.5 meters on the tree, you take a girth measurement, and the diameter at that point puts them in these various categories. So category A is anything up to 20 centimeter diameter. Category B is 20 to 40 centimeters diameter. C, 40 to 60, and D, anything over 60 centimeter diameter. So as you can see from these stats, it's largely Cat D trees that are affected. So the larger trees are getting hit before the smaller ones. Now these stats don't generally include woodland trees, because it's very hard to survey in woodlands and get a good impression of how far a tree has declined. So we've mainly concentrated on trees grown in the open or on edges or in smaller plantations, things like that. So we think the trees that are open grown generally seem to be getting hit by the spore load that's coming in on the wind. When we're in woodlands, we find that it's smaller trees, all the young saplings that are coming up are getting hit first. And we think this is because the leaf litter in the woodlands is where the spores are being generated from. So there is a discrepancy. I mean, we're quite fortunate. We had slightly different to the peak in that most of the woodlands in Sheffield only have ash as quite a small proportion of the canopy. They're generally oak, birch woodlands. And this is just the same data in a fancier fashion. You can see here, obviously the green is good, red is bad. And we did the surveys, we broke them down by area as well. So you can see here towards the right, the southeast and the southwest are much worse than the northeast and the northwest. And then you can see that broken down. So the bulk of the yellow and the orange down these areas. In the southeast in particular, as I said, we don't have ash as a major component of most of our ancient woodland. We do have a lot of plantations that were put in, say, in the 80s and the 90s. Particularly in the Mosborough townships, there's a lot of plantations down there which are predominantly ash and Norway maple. So we do have a bit of a problem down there, and a problem for the future as well. These are the 2020 stats so far. As I said, we haven't covered every area as yet, but we can already see that the dark green bars are much, much lower. So we're finding far fewer trees that are totally unaffected. I've got some comparison. I've got the comparison between the two later on, so we can have a look at that. And these are, again, by trunk diameter. And again, the category D and the category C, the larger trees that are disproportionately badly affected by this. The new category that's introduced there, the black, is 0%. These mostly are not trees that are totally dead, but they're trees that we have felled last year because they were much lower than 50% crown remaining. And those are the two comparisons. So that's all of the trees from 2020 so far, and all of the trees from 2019. As you can see, the major change is that there are far fewer trees that are totally unaffected. And again, you can see the difference here between the trunk diameters of the trees. We're still finding the same pattern, but you can see the light green bar is rising. So we'll see this wave. We expect to see that wave progress down. So next year, I would expect to see that orange bar quite a lot higher as more trees succumb. And this, for comparison, is the survey data from Norfolk. So this is from the last 4 years. And again, you can see how these bars, the yellow and the orange bars, are rising. Now, last year, we kind of figured that we were at roughly where they were in 2016. But it may be that we're slightly ahead of that now. We think we may have moved on a little bit faster. But again, we'll have to wait and see how the stats pan out when we've completed all the surveys. Now, I'm just going to quickly talk about this work that we did last year in Fulwood. I wanted to get a sense of how brittle these trees become. So we got Anderson's Tree Care to come and help us. We put a pull line up in these trees and gave them a pull with a measuring device that gave us a sense of at what point they would collapse, because we want to know if these trees are safe to climb and at what stage they start to become unsafe to climb. We got, it has to be said, a bewildering variety of results. This is a branch that we pulled off that I'll show you the end of in a minute. But you can see there's live growth all the way up it and dead twigs as well. And this is, it's really quite worrying, because where you get the dead twigs further down the branch, the fungus is entering at that point and beginning to cause brittleness in the stem. But whereas a tree climber might look at a totally dead branch and think, I'm not going to risk standing on that or attaching myself to that. If it actually has live growth on it, you might be a bit more inclined to. But we've found that it would be unwise to trust a branch like this. Because you can see this fracture surface here, this is from the same branch that we pulled off. This on the right, that's a normal tear. This fracture surface is quite flat. It's kind of got a ceramic fracture, and that indicates that is extremely brittle. And this one broke off at 184 kilograms of pressure, which is only a couple of times the weight of a climber. And you would exert that kind of pressure if you just dropped, say, half a meter onto a branch. So just stepping down onto a branch would exert that kind of pressure on it. So these are the kind of branches that climbers really need to look out for when they're moving around in the tree. But they may, if they're not aware of the unpredictability of ash dieback, then they may make a mistake which could seriously injure them. I have to warn you, the next slide does have quite a gruesome picture on it. So if you are at all squeamish, I would look away now. I'll only put it up for a bit. This is a chap from the document that Euroforest has distributed. There is a link, I have put a link on the website to it. That link doesn't appear to be working. It doesn't work from the Arbor Association's website either, so apologies for that. Now this chap was felling a tree underneath an ash tree that was largely dead. The problem is as soon as you put a chainsaw into the tree, it can cause vibrations that will dislodge fragile branches. This chap stepped back 3 meters, which would be your normal escape route if you were felling a tree, but he didn't go far enough because it shook a branch out and it came through his helmet and attacked him like that. One of the other problems is the felling. So the hinges may not be reliable. You can see that this tree's just gone off to the left there. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll have to shift on quite quickly. So this is our preferred method of felling from a moop, or with tree shears. This basically cuts the tree off at the base and takes it away. Now, what with restoring the landscape, we're going to be looking out for trees like the one in the top left-hand corner, the 100% live crowns. We'd like to run a program for people. We're going to be recording them. We'd like other people to look out for them where we can. Obviously, these are going to become more obvious as the disease takes hold. This is the kind of tree that we need to be propagating from. So if we can record these and then go back and collect seed from them, then we can perhaps propagate the next generation of resilient ash trees from them.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nathan. What's been really interesting is seeing the questions that they come in. So I think we're going to, there's some, I think what I'll do is, well, we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'll pose a question to each of you. If I'm going to make the judgment call on who I think best to answer, I'm afraid. And we'll hopefully get through them all. The first actually is an observation from Julie, who thinks that she's seen it in Althorpe and has been taking pictures of trees that she thinks might have dieback. But then she also has a question, which is, can you leave the dead wood of a diseased ash in situ, or should it be removed or burnt? So maybe that question for Luke first.
Sure. Yeah. No, there's no good in burning the wood or anything. You know, because of the nature of the cycle with the fruiting bodies on the dead leaf litter and then windborne spores, the wood doesn't actually play much of a part in the diseases cycle, so it can just sit there, and there are no restrictions on moving it or using it either, you know, if it still has a use.
And then the next question is the scale of the problem bigger than the loss of elms? I guess that is
actually yes. According to the Tree Council, yeah, it could be worse.
And that's, I've heard people say it was actually much easier to work with elm trees than ash. So that's one of the issues that local authorities are presented with, is that they're harder to fell than elms affected by Dutch elm disease.
Because elms generally die much quicker with the disease. So the ash are declining quite slowly year on year, so there's more potential for secondary pathogens to come in and make them brittle and unstable.
I'm going to put this next one to Luke, which is what can we do, just in light of the National Trust carbon targets you were talking about yesterday, which is what can be done to ensure the carbon stored in the ash wood is not released into the atmosphere? So is it feasible that it's buried as a way to improve soil carbon levels?
Yeah, really interesting one. I am not an expert in you know, the detail of the carbon cycle, but my understanding of the way, for instance, in a woodland it works with deadwood is that, you know, almost the net gain in carbon in woodland soils from fallen timber is a small net gain, because as soon as the wood starts to decay, the CO2 is released. So it's not being released by burning, but it's being released by the process of the fungi and the other organisms that are breaking it down. So the carbon will be released in woodland soils. So you'd have to bury it in anaerobic conditions to lock the carbon up, and I think realistically that isn't going to happen at any meaningful scale. But we do have to accept that, you know, certainly in woodland situations, that process of decomposition into woodland soils does get us a small net gain in carbon sequestration, and that's the best we can hope for. Really, the answer, as you said, Camilla, links to our woodland creation. We need to make a massive net gain in tree cover despite ash dieback, and that's our natural part solution to net carbon zero.
And I guess the next question is maybe first for Luke and then Nathan, I think, because the implications of maybe we'll be learning what they are for Sheffield over the coming months and years. But have you had any problems with private landowners and a refusal to do anything about trees? Is that an issue that either of you have dealt with?
That'll be one for Nathan, I think. Yeah.
Not yet. We haven't. We do have various problems. We've got there's highways enforcement who deal with trees that are threatening the highway, and then we have building control who deal with trees that are threatening private property or the public in areas away from the highway. There are definitely issues around dangerous trees where you can't trace owners, but in general we haven't really come across any major problems as yet. It's one of the reasons we did have a conference last year to try and bring together all stakeholders across Yorkshire, including major landowners and particularly farmers, the farming union, which is it's going to be really important to get them on side, because a lot of ash trees, particularly out in rural areas, are in fields along the roadside, so not in highways ownership generally, and putting the burden of all those felling costs on farmers is going to be very difficult, I think.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, yeah, so very much so. Nathan and I were involved in the beginning of a resilience forum for the region, so actually we'll come to a question at the end about that. Essentially, is what it is that people can do, so we'll get to that in a minute. I've got a question from Karen which asks, how would a felling programme be managed in the city? For example, would it start in the areas of the greatest concentration of ash, or would it be a citywide approach?
It's based on our general tree risk management anyway, so any tree that we consider as dangerous or has the potential to fall or drop branches is dealt with. So as soon as trees reach a certain level, we have a statutory duty to clear them up. So the programme will be starting in the southwest. The problems come when we have trees in other areas that say reach about 75% of their live crown, and we can reasonably suspect that they're not going to get any better, but they're in particularly hard to access locations. We may have to fell them slightly earlier, because if we leave them too long, they'll be unsafe for climbers to get to them. So one of the major considerations is the safety of contractors. They are the people at the greatest risk from ash dieback.
And I think that's I've got a kind of a comment and question from Sally, which I think kind of gets to some of the crux of the issue, which is that only yesterday she was contacted by a resident at the door who was very sad that an ash outside his house was due to be felled due to ash dieback and a fungal infection. She advised him to contact the council, and that she just points out that there's a huge issue around communication with residents, so they understand reasons and risk, and so what the council's plan is for that, because I think that's one thing I think is very important, is how, and I think we can say quite sort of explicitly, the grief of losing trees is going to be something that affects people, and emotions run high, but there's also a very significant safety element in how to deal with ash dieback. So is that something that the council strategy takes into consideration?
We were hoping to get our communications up and running late May, early June. We were planning to have another meeting of the local resilience forum then, and the pandemic has just put paid to a lot of that. It's totally overwhelmed our media department, so we haven't been able to get a lot of stuff out there as yet. but we are working on it. We do want to publicise it as much as we can, and post particular, wherever we are going to be felling large numbers of trees or felling individual trees, we will notify as far and wide as we can.
And just to add to Nathan's points there, I mean, hopefully there will be bits and pieces on the council website as soon as we can get it up there. It's getting there, but for now we have put more or less the same questions and answers on the Tree Week website. So if anyone does have any, if they want further details, it's got all the information there and all the links, particularly the Tree Council, that goes through what people should be looking at when they're concerned about ash dieback. So it'd be worth a look there for now, but it will be on.
That is already on the council website.
Is it? Oh,
yeah,
right.
you put it up now. Yeah. So
right. Well, that's good. So there is information there if people are worried about the council website.
Yeah. And I'm going to put the next question to Luke, which is again from Sally. She was wondering if the friends group that she's a part of should tackle small ash seedlings and saplings as part of their conservation work. So is there active conservation management that could help?
I would say definitely leave ash saplings and seedlings in woodlands to grow, and most of them sadly to die naturally, because the more reproduction by seed we get of ash, the more genetic variation we'll get, and the more chance we'll have of identifying tolerant specimens. So in woodland situations, we definitely want to let that natural process sort of cycle as rapidly as possible in the hope that we can identify the tolerant specimens. So the only place that I sort of wouldn't recommend it is in bigger trees with safety issues, really, or if you've got other objectives for woodland management. If no other species are getting away because you've just got thickets of dying ash, then it might be worth making space to allow other species to either plant or allow other species to regenerate. But essentially, no, let that cycle take place to find the healthy ones.
Thank you. And the next is I think maybe it's a kind of a comment from Michelle, who says she's interested in documenting individual ash trees before they get ill or disappear. That is something she's interested in as an artist photographer. And is there something that she, in particular, that she could consider in her approach that would make them useful for archival purposes? I'd suggest actually reading, this is where I was looking for my useful props, but as I'm finishing my thesis, there are literally, if you were to look either side of the screen, you'd just see terrifying piles of books. There's a wonderful book on the ash tree by Oliver Rackham, which is really worth looking at. So that's the beginning of, that was a book that he wrote before he died, that looks at sort of just celebrating the ash tree in a way that was never done for the elm. So I'd say that's probably a good starting point. Do either you or Nathan or Luke have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that book's a great starting point.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Yeah, Oliver Rackham is someone who really bridges the gap between nature and culture very, very well. And it covers that topic brilliantly. And I would just say record the location of the trees. That's the really big one, so that they can be sort of geolocated in future. If you've documented them, that'd be really interesting.
And I think in particular, we are, as I said, looking out for trees which are unaffected by it. So if you can get any pictures of them and document them, then that would be ideal, and that might save the future of the ash. And
are there any places that you would go to in particular to look at healthy specimens?
Who knows where they are? It's random. We know that roughly about 10% may be resistant to the ash. So it's
go on, Catherine.
I was just going to say there's a really nice one in Mount Pleasant Park that is so far unaffected. And the other type of ash that doesn't seem to be affected so far is manna ash, which has much finer leaves, and they so far have seemed okay. I don't know, you might know more about that, Nathan, whether manna ash is, I mean, I know it's vulnerable.
I've seen some, yeah.
It seems less vulnerable.
Yeah.
So that, but certainly native ash trees, if we can get those recorded, I think that would be really useful.
And I think we've just got a interesting comment from Julie, says that the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust is running a trial of different ash species at Grenna Woods, which I think is one of the things that's interesting at this point in time, where elm trees are being reintroduced after decades of research going into finding resistant forms of elm. And there are lots and lots of activities around the country. So there's a project called the Ash Archive, which has been a big extensive planting of ash trees in the south of England. But I think it's where, if anyone's interested, do get in touch with me, because this is one of my particular nerdinesses. And then we've got the last question, which I think may be one for Catherine and for Nathan, which is, who would you report ash dieback to? Is there any kind of process or email or survey that people could contribute to?
At the moment, we're conducting ash dieback surveys around the city, so we are keeping our eyes on them. If you see ash trees that are on private land that are next to the highway, you can contact highways for that. And otherwise, if you see trees on private land that may be in a back garden and threatening other gardens, then you can report them to building control. They will generally contact us and ask us to go and have a look. But ash trees on public land, we're looking out for them all the time. Unfortunately, our phone number isn't working in the minute because the office is closed. So you'd have to email in. You can email parksandcountryside@sheffield.gov.uk if you see any that are particularly bad on public land. I should also say, I did want to add that we are looking, in terms of recovery, we're looking at other species potentially to plant. We're looking at going into some of our woodlands and collecting seed from, particularly in woodlands where we have old coppice stools that have grown out. So we know those are trees that predate the 19th century. We can go in and collect those seeds and maybe use them to plant the next generation, not only in woodlands, in gaps where we may have lost some trees, but also potentially to get the public to grow them for us in their back gardens. This is something we're looking at because we know that potentially there may not be enough nursery stock in the country to replace all the ash trees that we're going to lose, and to meet our commitments for climate change in terms of tree cover. So that is something we're looking at.
It's definitely something that would be a great thing to do, you know, where ashes are affected, and watch this space really. We'll work together to try and sort something out. COVID allowing, of course, COVID allowing.
All outdoor work, so.
Yeah, exactly. So it should be good. Let's hope.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've just got a comment from Christine, who, and I think what's really, Jesus, someone starts beeping their horn outside my front door. The Sheffield Tree Map is a really good online resource which shows street trees which are located by species. So that could be something that could be, it's worth just looking at the different tools. There's the iTree survey, and just getting to grips with things, work that has been done and what people could contribute to. I just wonder if we've got any last comments from our panel today.
Yes, I was just going to add, because I ran out of time a bit on mine. One of the things that I think is going to be absolutely necessary for replacing tree cover is that we're going to have to plant or work with people to plant on private land, because there just simply isn't enough public land available to replace everything. One of the things that we can do, we can extend our woodlands by fencing off and allowing natural regeneration, things like that. We can plant some trees in parks, but we can't necessarily replace the connectivity that you get in a hedgerow, a line of ash in a hedgerow, or between individual ash trees growing in private gardens in certain areas of the city. So losing that web of connections will be a massive loss. And we need to put something back into those kind of spaces. That will be really important. So if anybody out there is a massive landowner, then get in touch with us. We'd love to plant on your land. Or, you know, any private householder will be able to help out in that regard as well.
Yeah, if there's anyone that needs trees, come and see us.
Yeah.
You know, we can supply you with trees. So yeah, that'll be good.
Brilliant. Luke, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, it struck me that the only thing we haven't really touched on is species selection of those replacement trees, and that's a ginormous topic in its own right. So there's no time for that now. But just to, you know, just to mention it, that it's quite a challenge. It's actually probably less of a challenge in the urban realm than it is in our sort of nature conservation sites, because we do have that little bit more freedom to look at, you know, whether it's climate resilience or, you know, amenity species or amenity cultivars that work really well for people. But yeah, we need to think really, really hard about that to make sure that we're replacing our ash with the appropriate species. And as I did mention in my talk, that we ensure future resilience by really spreading that diversity as far as we can. And we must replant or ensure regeneration, so we do make that massive net gain.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think this is a talk has really made me all the more sure that, you know, workshops and there's an appetite. There's so much, I think, you know, from the poetry through to the art, through to the science and ecology and planting. There's a lot that could be covered, and I think there's a lot that could be really engaged. You know, the constructive contribution of people engaged with this as an issue actually will have manifold benefits, I think, as well as it being quite often quite a challenging and alarming subject matter. It could be a catalyst for something that's actually quite positive, with looking for a sort of net gain as opposed to a net loss. I think I've got shivers from that picture of the poor man with the branch through his helmet. So
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. I think it's good to be reminded of. Anyway, so like I said, I think watch this space. This is very much the beginning of a conversation. I'd just like to say thank you very much for Nathan and Luke joining us today and sharing their knowledge and experience. I think there's obviously an appetite for more, so hopefully that will be something that post-corona we'll be looking at addressing. There are more events over the coming days, so if this has whetted your appetite, tomorrow we're going to be talking art and design of trees, I think some which again may touch on ash dieback. We've got an event on trees and soil.
We have 4:30 today. Very important. Very important to trees.
Yeah, you've got time to make a cup of tea in between. Register if you're not yet registered. We've got Paul Wood, who's been mapping the trees of London, talking on Friday. And I think also really importantly, we've got the launch of the Sheffield Street Tree Strategy on Friday, which is a really, I think, given the sort of political nature of trees in Sheffield over the last few years, it's a really positive moment for us to sort of see what the future holds. And just before I start pressing the red button, I've got a nice comment from Nicola saying that this is a brilliant talk. I'll take that. Anyway, so thank you to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's been really appreciated, and look forward to seeing you at another of the events. All right.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.